Good evening, and thank you for joining us for this important event. The program will begin momentarily, but first, I'd like to share a few notes with respect to accessibility and to ensure that you have the best possible experience. First, if you have questions, please place them in the Q&A by clicking on the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. Not the chat, but the Q&A icon. However, please monitor the chat because we will be placing a few helpful resources in there for you throughout the program. If you or someone you know needs access to closed captions, please click on the CC Live translation icon at the bottom of your screen. Lastly, if you or someone you know needs access to Spanish translations, please click on the interpretation icon at the bottom of your screen. Thank you, and now we will begin the program. It is my pleasure to introduce Kiki Jamison, President of the Fund for New Jersey.
Good evening. I'm Kiki Jamison, President of the Fund for New Jersey. And on behalf of the Fund and all our co-sponsor partners, thank you for joining us tonight for the third installment of Imagine More, Racial Justice Begins With Us. Imagine More is the first of its kind six-part series of events that brings together national thought leaders, philanthropic and community-based organizations, academic institutions, policy advocates, jurists, and local activists from across the ideological spectrum, united around a common purpose: advancing racial justice and repairing the harmful impacts of systemic racism. Over the course of this series, you will hear from changemakers who will offer action plans for making concrete changes in wealth distribution, the criminal legal system, housing, education, health, and political power. Although each session focuses on a different topic, we recognize that all of these topics are interconnected. That is why our speakers will also propose solutions to repair the harm created by all of these injustices. Additionally, following each event, you will receive resources and information to connect you with the organizations doing this important work and to guide you in leading change in your own communities. We launched Imagine More in February, and we are enormously proud that nearly 1,000 people from across the state and beyond have registered for our series, demonstrating that not only do they understand the urgent need to address racial injustice, but that they also want to help. Tonight, we are challenging New Jersey to ensure access to safe and affordable housing for all, especially our state's diverse communities who have been left out. So welcome to our third event, Achieving Safe and Healthy Homes for All. We are delighted to present Reverend Eric Dobson. Eric, who's Deputy Director of the Fair Share Housing Center, which fights to defend the rights of New Jersey's poor by monitoring, enforcing, and expanding the Mount Laurel Doctrine. Eric will help us understand the current reality surrounding affordable housing in New Jersey, who can access it, and what can be done to repair the harms of structural racism that infuse it. Eric will then be joined by Cheryl Cashin, author and Carmack Waterhouse Professor of Law, Civil Rights and Social Justice at Georgetown University, and Gantry Fox, Director of Operations at Salvation and Social Justice. Grizelia Berry, the Vice Chair of the Fund for New Jersey, will moderate an interactive discussion with tonight's speakers and will include questions from you, the audience. And now, here is Reverend Eric Dobson. Welcome, Eric.
Thank you, Kiki, and thank you all who have joined us tonight for this very important conversation. All of New Jersey deserve a safe, healthy, and affordable place to call home. But far too often, the basic human right is not attainable, especially for people of color. Now, it's impossible to talk honestly and openly about access to housing and what that looks like today without first grounding the conversation in our nation's history on race and what that truly means for Black and brown people in this country. Our entire society, in fact, was built on the belief that white race was superior to others. While this notion evolved over time to be more publicly unacceptable, the truth is that this racial hierarchy is deeply embedded throughout our society. From the founding of our country, Black and brown people were killed, enslaved, and devalued. So it's important for us to have a real conversation about these topics. So let me go on and talk about modern day racial injustice and how it presents itself as a complicated web of public and private policies that are specifically designed to disadvantage people of color and maintain power and wealth for white communities. In the housing sector, this has presented itself in many forms, most notably in redlining, exclusionary zoning, racially restricted covenants. These policies have driven and maintained hyper-segregation regions like Camden and Newark around the country, resulting in historic disinvestments from Black and brown communities that have disconnected people of color from regional opportunities, high-quality public infrastructure, and wealth. The impact of residential segregation on individual families and communities cannot be misunderstated. Where one lives is directly tied to its educational outcomes, economic opportunities, and health. New Jersey has one of the worst racial disparities in our country across almost all of these indicators of success and well-being. But despite all of this, there is still hope to propel us forward. New Jersey, in fact, has one of the strongest legal frameworks to prevent exclusionary zoning in our country. Just over 50 years ago, residents from the historical Black community of Mount Laurel organized to protest the town policies, which was trying to push these folks out of their homes who had been there since the 1800s. The collective power of the local community ultimately resulted in a landmark civil rights case known as the Mount Laurel Doctrine. The doctrine prevents exclusionary zoning and requires all towns in New Jersey to provide for this fair share of the region's affordable housing. Now, to date, Fair Share Housing Center has settled with more than 300 cases under the Mount Laurel Doctrine. An estimated approximately 70,000 units of affordable housing have already been built in New Jersey as a result of Mount Laurel. And we anticipated approximately 50,000 new affordable homes to be constructed within the next decade. Recently, Governor Murphy proposed a historical $335 million investment in already approved projects based upon these Mount Laurel settlements, and we're still awaiting financing. This funding will help accelerate development to more quickly address the deep shortage of affordable housing in our state. But building housing is only the first step to safeguard access, and far too often low-income communities of color still face housing discrimination in New Jersey. As we celebrate the 54th anniversary of the Federal Fair Housing Act this month, April is Fair Housing Month, we must remain steadfast in our fight to dismantle structural barriers that get in the way of people obtaining housing. To that end, last year, New Jersey passed the Fair Chance in Housing Act, the first statewide law of its kind in the country. It protects individuals, returning citizens from being discriminated in the rental market. There are these types of policy we must continue to advance along with investments in develop of affordable housing. Achieving safe and affordable homes for all is a complicated and multifaceted issue, but requires an intersectional and interdisciplinary approach to address. I look forward to continue this conversation this evening with my esteemed co-panelists, and I hope you will enjoy walking away with a clear understanding of what we're up against and where we're going and how we can tap into our work here in New Jersey.
Thank you so much, Eric, for those important and foundational remarks. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce tonight's moderator, Grizelia Berry, the Vice Chair of the Board of the Fund for New Jersey. Grizel is the president and sole proprietor of G.U. Berry Incorporated. Prior to starting her consulting firm, Grizel's 33-year-long career included assisting nonprofit organizations with executing countless community development initiatives and serving as the director of Essex County Housing and Community Development Division, where she helped 18 municipalities improve their housing stock, rehabilitate their neighborhoods and business districts. Welcome, Grizel.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, Kiki. It is an absolute pleasure to be here with you this evening to continue the Imagine More Racial Justice Begins With Us event series, and to be able to moderate this important discussion on achieving safe and healthy homes for all in New Jersey. Without further ado, let's meet our panelists for this evening discussion. We've already met Reverend Eric Dobson, but I wish to say a little bit more about him. In addition to his role as Deputy Director of Fair Share Housing Center, Eric is also an ordained minister, a community organizer, an outreach specialist, and a social entrepreneur. He is also the co-founder of Open Communities, which is a racial integration consulting firm that works to resolve simple yet complex conflicts of race, ethnicity, and socioeconomics. He is also the founder of Planting Seeds of Hope, a nonprofit focused on youth development and education. Thank you for joining us, Eric, and providing such critical state policy and advocacy context to tonight's conversation. I also want to introduce Cheryl Cashin. Cheryl is the Carmack Waterhouse Professor of Law, Civil Rights, and Social Justice at Georgetown University. She currently teaches constitutional law, race, and American law, and she's also has a seminar with a writing seminar about American segregation, education, and opportunity. Cheryl is also an author. Her 2021 book, White Space and Black Hood, Opportunity, Hoarding, and Segregation in the Area of Inequality, a book that's about the role of residential segregation in producing racial inequality. Welcome, Cheryl. And then tonight, I also want to welcome Gantry Fox, Director of Operations at the Salvation and Social Justice Organization. Prior to his current position, Gantry led the organization's Police Accountability Program. He also served for 10 years as the director of multiple Philadelphia diversionary court programs, working with the Public Health Management Corporation. In addition to his current role with Salvation and Social Justice, he is also a New Jersey Environmental Justice Alliance board member. Thank you for being here, Gantry. So let's move on. I like to begin with a question with Eric, in fact. Eric, there is a lot of misconception around what affordable housing is. Can you define affordable housing for us?
Yes, that's a great question. And I think a lot of folks misconstrue what affordable housing is. So in New Jersey, affordable housing is based upon the area median income. So for folks who are qualified for affordable housing, it could be those who are low income, medium income, senior citizens, veterans, those with special needs. So you're talking about people who work in our hotels, restaurants, teachers, seniors who are trying to downsize. So, these are the people who have jobs, who work, who have to go through the application process, who have to verify income, just like all of us. So when folks think about affordable housing, oftentimes they get this idea in their head thinking that it's people who don't have jobs and who aren't working. That's not the case. Affordable housing in New Jersey is for folks who are working, who has a legal source of income, and who are really working sometimes 2 jobs trying to afford rent and mortgages in New Jersey. New Jersey is one of the wealthiest states in the nation and have one of the highest income rent cost of living incomes in the country. So affordable housing is for folks who are working, and to those who believe that it's for subsidized housing, Let me give you a little tidbit of information that if you're not aware of this, those who live in high opportunity communities and don't want affordable housing. If you have a mortgage on your house, you live in subsidized housing. Your mortgage is subsidized by taxpayers and the government. So hello, so for you to try to exclude people out of affordable housing, you yourself live in subsidized housing.
Well, thank you for that. It's a really great explanation. Let me move on to Professor Cashin. Even though redlining is illegal, it persists in all of our lending practices today, and it reinforces racial inequality within the financial system. What strategies are there that can address this long-standing practice and could lead towards increased credit opportunities for people of color who want to purchase or refinance a home in their neighborhoods?
So it's wonderful to be with all of you. First, it's important to understand the role of segregation in facilitating redlining. Classically, redlining began in the 1930s. Basically, everywhere the more than 6 million Black people who moved north and west from the South, the great migrants moved, virtually every city where they landed in large numbers, including Newark, including Camden, they were segregated into their own neighborhoods through violence, restrictive covenants, exclusionary zoning, and then those neighborhoods were marked as hazardous, risky, and cut off from traditional subsidized government-insured mortgages, the largest wealth building program the federal government ever sponsored, right? So that's the first generation of redlining. By cutting off, and it started these habits which endure 8 decades on of lenders perceiving people in Black and brown segregated neighborhoods as risky investments. So what that did is it opened up people in those neighborhoods to speculative, predatory, non-traditional credit products. And to this day, and particularly with private equity, Black and brown people are being treated to buying property through installment contracts, like buying on layaway, that are designed for people to fail. So how do you combat this kind of anti-brown systemic discrimination? One, that government can intentionally try to greenline historically defunded, historically redlined neighborhoods. It's easy to identify these neighborhoods. You look at the old HOLC maps, but prioritize historically defunded neighborhoods for fair credit terms and outreach and education, calling out, and we should call out actors, institutional actors like private equity, like I just did, that have a habit of preying on people. They should be sued, right? We should shine a light on these practices. But if local governments have a, kind of racial equity policies where they are targeting neighborhoods that have been historically preyed upon for fair credit products and outreach, that can help disrupt this long decades of discriminatory behavior.
Thank you very much. Gantry, what's been your personal experience with the lack of affordable housing?
Well, that was basically my childhood, Grizel. As the eldest, I can remember my mother first struggling as a single parent after her separation with my father, and then later throughout her second marriage. Even working 2 and sometimes 3 jobs, she just could not find housing of any kind that she was able to afford without having to make a choice between things like food or clothing or utilities. It was very difficult for her to find help of any kind whatsoever. She often was directed to the most poor and dangerous environments particularly Camden. We were in South Jersey, and she just didn't want us to be there. She was told on several occasions by white professionals that she was uppity and ungrateful. And I don't know if it's the same now, but she was also told in order to receive government assistance, she needed to be in a 2-bedroom because she had children of the opposite sex. And mom wouldn't risk lying or misrepresenting anything about us. So it excluded us. And between the ages of, I would say 7 and probably 12, I can remember being bounced around, being in 3 different school districts, between 3rd grade and 6th grade, living with relatives, my mom's coworkers, acquaintances. Sometimes we had to be separated. My mother remarried when I was like 12, and they both had full-time jobs, but often were denied loans and things and were considered a financial risk. My stepfather was so happy he was able to get a VA loan, but they understood nothing about the paperwork they were signing. And my mom recently told me that when she originally looked at the paperwork, it said like $50,000 for a house back then. They put us in another neighborhood that, was an urban neighborhood and poor. But at the end of the paperwork, it actually said 100,000 after she had signed. And so then that began my parents sacrificing one bill for another. Sometimes we went without lights. Sometimes we went without adequate amounts of food. We often went without upgrading our wardrobes. We even went an entire summer without electricity, storing food in an ice cooler, using candles, and we still eventually experienced foreclosure. All of us was waiting for like a year or so. My mom was then being told she wasn't eligible because now she wasn't a single parent, she was married. And again, my mother wouldn't run the risk of lying or breaking the law for assistance. So we had to remain separated for roughly a year and a half. Found another apartment. We were evicted from that shortly after my college graduation. And that was just me being home alone, not knowing the issue, and having basically sheriff's officers show up at the door and give me 4 minutes to pull together everything I could possibly carry and left everything else in the apartment. So it was my full span of my childhood.
Thank you for such a personal story. Could you tell us why you have chosen to share this story with us tonight?
Yeah, I mean, this brings back some very rough memories to mind, many that I'm not sharing. But it was important for both me and my mother, because I discussed this with her, that I share a small portion of our story in hopes that it may touch a professional that's in a position to make a difference, an advocate to remain on fire and passionate in the fight. And most of all, to let those that know who may be struggling now, that trouble doesn't last always, and God can bring you through storms if you remain faithful. And in our own way, we both still deal with it, me and my mother. I grew up faster than I should have, and faced realisms that I shouldn't have had to face. I felt like my mother and my sister's only true protector. Though touching, it's kind of sad. I felt no one cared about us but us. And I had to be the little guy, and kind of took this us against the world attitude. I had a terrible temper that got me in trouble in school, behaviorally, though I was good academically. It was my attempt of controlling anything I could, since there was so much that I couldn't, if that makes sense. There were moments when I was angry with God. My mother was an evangelist in music at the time. My father was a associate minister. And it was the first time I actually walked out of church with my eyes full of tears, because I couldn't stand seeing them praise God when I felt like they were being unfairly persecuted. My mom shared with me that she felt like she was a horrible parent. This is recently. And being a parent now myself, I can only imagine how gut-wrenching that must have felt for them. She even said to see me being young and strong hurt her as well. They don't deal with the housing stability issue now. It's been a little while since they've probably been stable, couple decades now. But those impacts remain. They're still skeptical, excuse me, of those who say they're trying to help. My mom has difficulty getting comfortable anywhere, no matter how long she lives there. Always feels she's going to have to get up and go, even though finances are not telling her that. And they hold on to things. They don't want to throw things away. They don't want to replace it with something new. It's kind of this save money at all costs type of impact. And being in this type of situation when you cannot afford housing creates so many additional tensions: food security, transportation, academic performance or behavior, socialization as an adolescent, self-assuredness, separation anxiety because we were being split up often, spiritual conflict, a parentified child. And this is why I appreciate the conversation that we're having tonight and the efforts to minimize these hurts for other people.
Thank you for that. It's very, very important to hear those kinds of stories. Before I go on, I just want to remind the audience that we do have a portion of today's seminar to take on questions, and we have a Q&A where you can add questions. So please do, so that we can engage our panelists a little bit more. So with that, let me circle back to Eric. Eric, what laws and accountability measures currently exist to ensure that local city and state governments, developers, and even landlords prioritize increasing the availability of affordable housing?
Great question. I just wanted to just comment on Gantry's story because it reiterates what Professor Cashin has been writing about for years, about structural and racial segregation orchestrated by our government. So it wasn't God that was turning his back on Gantry and his family. It was our government. So Victor Hugo says that if a soul is left in darkness, sin will be committed. The guilty one is not who committed the sin. The guilty one is the one who committed the darkness. So when we have a federal system that favored whites and discriminated against blacks, that's the guilty one, the system itself that creates darkness. And so we have laws in New Jersey, the Mount Laurel Doctrine, but we also have, laws that, in terms of local, opportunities for local towns in New Jersey to create their own inclusionary zoning ordinance that the town can pass to make sure there's 20 or 30% of affordable housing when they're doing new development or redevelopment. So there are state laws and there are opportunities for towns to really embrace inclusion and embrace integration and see how it favors the community, see how it favors our country. So local folks can get involved and the local towns can pass their own laws to ensure that there is enough housing that's affordable for everyone, that the town is represented by all of its constituents and not just the wealthy, but they're represented by those who are low income, those who are middle income and moderate income, those who are seniors and those who have special needs and veterans. So there are local laws, the Mount Laurel Doctrine, which we enforce, but also local towns can pass their own ordinance.
Thank you. Professor Cashin, you wrote a book about residential caste that demonstrates how the US government, through its policies, created both ghettos and affluent white neighborhoods. On your final chapter, you have it's entitled Abolition and Repair, calls for a focus on repair rather than reparation. Could you explain that distinction for us? You're on mute.
Sorry. Right. Thank you for mentioning the book. But no, I argue in the first 8 chapters of the book that we have a system of residential caste in which we overinvest and exclude in affluent, predominantly white space through government policy, and we disinvest and contain and frankly prey on people, both financially and with policy, with aggressive policing in high poverty Black and brown neighborhoods. And that all of us are ensconced in this system of residential caste. All of the people who are excluded, primarily through exclusionary zoning from high opportunity places, is subsidizing those high opportunity places with their gas taxes, with their sales tax, income taxes, all the golden infrastructure there, all the public investment there. People who are excluded are paying for that, right? So what I argue in the final chapter, Abolition and Repairs, cutting checks, which is what reparations are often associated with. I'm not against reparations so much as, but even if you had a system of housing reparations like the city of Evanston has adopted, if you don't disrupt, abolish, and repair present day systems of residential caste, you're still going to continue to have these habits of concentrating wealth and concentrating poverty. So I call for abolition repair, meaning, first of all, I identify very clearly throughout the book what the present systems are, the present practices of residential caste, and there are 3: boundary maintenance, doubling down on boundaries, opportunity hoarding, overinvesting in white space, disinvesting elsewhere, and stereotype-driven surveillance, which is really about police reform, which I won't get into. So repair means doing the opposite. And I said this before, so inclusionary zoning, as Reverend Dobson has talked about, Eric, right? Inclusionary zoning rather than exclusionary zoning, right? Racial equity and prioritizing historically defunded places rather than giving them much less than their fair share or overinvesting in other places, right? That's what repair is about, and that is why I prioritize it.
Okay, great. Do you have any other repair ideas besides the 2 that you just mentioned?
Okay, well, it's no small thing. Now, New Jersey's ahead of a lot of places, but mandatory inclusionary zoning, every town should have it, right? So that as you're building and going forward, it's like the exclusion is 8 decades, actually a century in the making. We have to develop the habit of mandating inclusion year in and year out as we build, so people get in the habit again of living in proximity, God forbid, to duplexes, triplexes, multifamily in every community, right? So that's not a small thing. And the other thing is racial equity, right? Many communities, if you do an analysis of your budgeting, where your dollars that you spend for the kinds of things that develop communities, most communities, if you do your analysis, you will find that you are spending 3 and 4 times as much money in majority white neighborhoods as majority Black and brown ones. That's inequitable, right? So having a formal budget process that requires you to consider racial equity and start prioritizing historically invested places is also no small thing. Those are my 2 top recommendations.
All right, great, terrific. I have about 5 minutes before I move on to the audience. So I have 2 more questions that I'd like both Eric and Gantry to answer. And so the first one to Gantry, as a community advocate, can you share ways communities can talk about affordable housing, as well as how they can support efforts for increasing affordable housing within their own neighborhoods?
Sure. I definitely believe it begins with the community and those with lived experiences recognizing their power and realizing that they have expertise because they live. They need to believe that they deserve a seat at the table concerning affordable housing issues, and then making sure others understand their worth and dedication. In doing so, we need to embrace some of our traumas, and instead of allowing it to foster self-defeat like attitudes, use it to recognize our own resilience and strength. We needn't be afraid of that vulnerability and welcome the opportunity to gather, creating synergy with others of like minds and experiences. And those who haven't been impacted directly need to realize it could happen to anyone, including them or their loved ones, given a change in circumstances. The stereotypical idea of who can afford a home or affordable living isn't always on point, hence the term stereotype. We have to be committed to researching and learning what we don't know, partnering with advocacy groups such as Fair Share Housing to be focused, targeted, intentionally strategic in our efforts for policy change. And always be sure to know where the candidates running for local office and state offices stand on this issue and others that you're concerned about, and vote accordingly.
Thank you. And I have 2 more minutes for one more question to Eric this time. Something similar to what I asked Gantry, but a little different. Eric, what are some concrete and practical actions that people that are tuning into this webinar can take right now to support the work of the Fair Share Housing Center and to support more affordable housing?
Thank you. A great question. One is a concrete, you can go to our website. We have a action alert for the 2023 budget. As Professor Cashin pointed out, budgets are important. You need to, make sure your communities is prioritizing budgets for communities that were disinvested. So that's one thing. Look at, go to our website. There's an action alert that talks about the 2023 budget. The other thing I want to invite you to, invitation to our event on the 29th. We're going to be talking about housing access and barriers with the Lieutenant Governor, the Attorney General, and the chair of New Jersey's Housing Committee, Assemblywoman Lopez. So these are things that these conversations, engage in these conversations, as Gantry was talking about, get involved, and look at local activists who are doing things and get involved. And the last thing I want to invite you to is an invitation to a rally for around cannabis funding, reinvestment for May 18th. As you all know, recreational marijuana went on sale in New Jersey. And I don't know if you saw the news, the lines were wrapped around the corner. And kudos to our partners here in New Jersey, Salvation for Social Justice, the United Black Agenda, all of our folks who are advocating for the legalization of recreational marijuana and cannabis use. So we want some of that cannabis funding to go towards housing, to go towards affordable housing. So in May, we're having a rally. Again, you can go to our website. We're going to the state capitol, and we're going to talk about utilizing cannabis funding to support affordable housing. New Jersey has a shortage of affordable housing. The reason why housing in New Jersey is so expensive is because we have underproduced affordable housing that makes market rate housing go higher. So it affects all of us. The underproduction of affordable housing makes market rate housing go higher. So all of us are paying a price for segregation. Segregation is expensive.
Well, I want to thank the panelists, but we're not done yet. I'd like to now move and open up the floor to our audience. Again, I want to encourage people to, if they have a question, to please use the Q&A feature so that we can continue to provide questions to the panelists. So I already have a couple that we received from during registration, and I'd like to start with this one posed by James. The median net worth of white family is approximate $352,000. For Black families, it's only $6,000. Home ownership, or the lack of it, is the biggest factor to that. And so how and when can we close this gap? So I don't know if Eric would like to answer that, and Cheryl, but I'll give it to either one of you.
I'll let
Or
Professor
both of you.
Professor Cash go in, but I would say this: it took us how many centuries to get to where we are. This was social engineering. The wealth that was created for white folks was American social engineering to create this. So it's going to take a reversal of that social engineering and making those investments to get us back on track where equity is important, and that we all, let me say this and pass it to Professor Cashin. I think enough of us could live, I think too many of us live in the world and accept it as the way it is, opposed to living in a world the way it should be. And we all can reimagine this country and this state. We all dream about what type of community we want to live in, what type of people we want to be. We all are dreamers. We all are idealists, but too many of us have settled for the way things are, opposed to the way things could be.
Okay. Cheryl, do you want to add anything to that?
Two quick responses. First off, in many cities in this country, it is illegal to build anything other than a single family detached home on as much as 75% of the land in that state. In LA County, 78% of the land, right? Okay. So, and there's, so what we've ordered society through this zoning to privilege only people who can afford a single family detached home, right? And when you see that wealth gap, okay, so, people who can't afford to buy a home can't get equity, can't grow it, right? So again, zoning, if we zone for duplexes, triplexes, a lot more, multifamily coming, smaller homes that a lot of people, including millennials, people getting out of college with so much debt, it's like a mortgage, so that people can grab on to their dreams of home ownership in different ways, then people could accumulate equity, right? The second thing I'll say, and I'm going to contradict myself, though I focus on repair of systemic practices, I do think it's worth looking at the Evanston model of reparations. They had a very specific history in that city that they decided they were going to atone for by having, if you could prove that you descended from someone or you yourself had lived through a certain era of redlining, then you could qualify for I think it was a $25,000 reparations grant that could be used only for either a down payment on a home or improvement of a home, right? There are, different views about it, but if the wealth gap is born of cutting Black Americans out of the 30-year mortgage subsidized by the federal government starting in the 30s. We don't have to go back to slavery, right? And so it correlates with that. And so, yeah, maybe there should be some thought about housing opportunity for people who are credit worthy, where they may get help with a down payment, right? But you need a lot of different types of housing.
And Giselle, could I jump in real quick just to follow up on Professor?
Okay, go right ahead. Keep it short, because I have like 6 questions that came in.
Right. There's a local example of an institution who have done this in New Jersey. And I think more institutions and more towns need to do this. Princeton Theological Seminary put aside $25 million for reparations because they realized what that university have done to harm Black people in that era. So I think it is not just on towns, as Professor Cashin talked about. Local towns can do it, and institutions who's played a role in this should be able to do so also. And Princeton Theological Seminary is a representation of a university or institution who have done that locally in New Jersey. I just want to highlight them.
Terrific. So I have a really interesting question from Craig that I'm going to read. I just got it in. Developers often try and too often succeed in placing Mount Laurel housing in marginal low-lying areas that are subject to flooding. Most importantly, this puts these residents at risk of personal and property damage, but it also pits affordable housing advocates against each other. it would be very helpful if any or on the panelists could speak to this practice and if any measures to restrict this callous practice that impacts folks of color.
So there are some towns who have tried that, and I think it's up to the local towns to, when we talk about, the fair, the Mount Laurel doctrine, towns are obligated to rezone certain areas in the event that those areas are designated for redevelopment or development for housing. So there are areas where a town cannot develop for housing, so that would exclude that from happening. And there are some towns who would try to do that, but under the law, that is restricted. So there are opportunities to fight that. There are opportunities for local folks to get involved when that is happening, to sound the alarm, call Fair Share Housing Center. We will get engaged in that, but for the most part, that is outlawed, and it does, towns do try to do that, but for the most part, that is restricted. You can't develop in terms of, environment. There are environmental laws that are restrict towns from doing stuff like that. So it doesn't happen as much as people think.
Okay. So I have an anonymous, they didn't put a name on it, but I think it's an interesting question. Why is there hope that things will change from Gantry's experience, given that little has really improved as we near the 55th anniversary of the 67th ride, especially when we have had mainly liberal politicians in New Jersey? And so, Gantry, would you like to try and answer that? You're on mute, by the way.
Yeah, I'll try. I mean, I can only speak from a personal perspective, and and as you heard me tell my story, I'm rooted in my faith, right? And I believe God can do all things. Not only just that, but there's something really deep inside of me that feels that I'm accountable to those that came before me, right? And there were things that they did and changes they tried to strive and make that they didn't see come to fruition. They didn't see it happen, but they knew generations after them would. And maybe it's not to the level, some of those things that they would have liked to see it, but still be it progress. And though that's my personal commitment, that's why I'm in the social justice field, advocacy field, because if there's no hope, then why are we doing any of this work? Why are we doing any of it? It can be a dark work sometimes, but there's a commitment, and there's a light at the end of the tunnel. I feel, even if it's not my end of the tunnel, right? I have children. I'm going to have grandchildren and such.
Thank you for that. So I've gotten a question from Peter. The First Amendment has recently been weaponized by developers at the planning and zoning boards. What could local government do to make greenlining a reality? I'm not sure what greenlining means here, so maybe, I don't know. Professor Cashin, can you answer that? Is that possible, or Eric?
Well, since I use the word greenlining, I feel like I have to say something, but I need more. I'm not sure what the questioner means about how the First Amendment's been weaponized by developers. I'm kind of ignorant there. I'm not sure what they're talking about.
I don't know either. Eric, what about you? Do you know what that could mean?
I'm not sure exactly what that person is saying in the First Amendment,
So,
but I think greenlining is something that Professor Cashin knows a lot about.
All right. So why don't we try to answer that question, that part of the question? What do you see happening with greenlining becoming a reality?
First of all, I made up that term. I just made up the term. I said, what's the opposite of redlining? It's greenlining.
Greenlining, okay.
Right. So let the world know I've invented the term, and I'm just sort of what it means to me is prioritizing investment and lending in historically redlined areas, right? And historically, and the same areas that were redlined, in the 30s and going 40s, 50s, are also roughly the same areas that were targeted by large institutional lenders for predatory lending, you know, causing a foreclosure crisis in the 2000s, 2008, 2009, 2010, right? And then you have, again, private equity speculators going into the same neighborhoods that had all these houses foreclosed, like buying them up. You know, you can buy a foreclosed property for $5,000, turn around and sell it to working class Black and brown people for $30,000 on an installment contract that's designed for them to fail. They get no equity until the final payment, and they want them to miss a payment. They miss a payment, they default, churn it, and give it to someone else, right? It is despicable, right? So the dollars, hard-earned dollars of essential workers are being transferred through these installment contracts to titans who sit there and collect money. You know, it's despicable, right? So when I say greenlining, I mean disrupting those practices, but I do think we need trusted community institutions and government themselves to look out for people and target and say, okay, you know, we'll open a window, you know, a credit window from the city government for low cost loans, or maybe even a grant, if you can show that you've been on the receiving end of some of this stuff. And we'll find some trusted lending partners, CDCs or something, right? That so you can, you know, have trusted institutions help people, first of all, learn how to be credit worthy, right? And buy a home without being preyed upon.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I just want to jump in and add, you know, Professor Casson, you know, I read all her books because she's phenomenal. You know, when you think about the government coming out of the Great Depression, like, and this is how white wealth was created, right? The government invested in creating the white suburbs to the exclusion of Black people. So the New Deal was good for white America, but it was bad for Black America. And so, you know, when we talk about, you know, the government making an investments to create the middle class, greenlining is exactly what Professor Cashin said. We've done this before for whites. Why can't we do that for Black and brown folks? We have a history of doing it. And so I just want to point that out. Like, again, if you have a mortgage, if anyone's listening to this program or watching this program or streaming, if you have a mortgage, you live in subsidized housing. And so it's okay for suburban whites to live in subsidized housing and have help from the federal government, but not for people of color. That's a disservice.
All righty. I look forward to seeing this word in the Webster Dictionary someday. But let me move on. I have a question from Valerie. I feel like there's an entire industry, lawyers, political consultants, developers, etc., in New Jersey that exists to fight any Mont Laurel doctrine attempt to create affordable housing. The industry is economically and politically powerful. We won't win without engaging them. How do we do so? Eric?
That's a great question. I think, you know, one of the things that we do, we love to partner with local community members. We have an outreach team. You know, one of the things that's important, and let me say this for those who want to engage in this, you know, everything is localized in New Jersey. So there are certain things that are happening in certain towns that are not happening in other towns. So we need folks on the ground. When you see new development happening in your town, you should ask, is it an affordable housing obligation? What are the affordable housing requirements for that, to make sure towns are doing what they're supposed to be doing? So yeah, I think, you know, connect, you know, our action alerts, sign up for our newsletters, engage with us, because, you know, there's 566 municipalities in New Jersey, over 600 school districts. So, and we're a staff of 15. But, you know, sign up for our newsletter, engage with us. And yes, there is an industry who wants to really profit off of excluding folks. poverty is profitable. Let's not get it twisted here. Like, there's a lot of money in poverty. There's a lot of money in creating the ghettos and sustaining that. There are folks are benefiting from that. And unfortunately, too many of us are caught up in this myth and this illusion of race and individual rights and having my own, while the 1% gets wealthy and all of us are fighting for scraps and for crumbs. So this is, like I said, too many of us have accepted the way things are, opposed to really, living the way things should be. And we can do that. We can change. I believe in this country. I believe in our Constitution and Declaration of Independence. My ancestors believed in it. That's why they fought for it. That's why the first person who died in the Revolutionary War was a Black person. The first person who died for voting rights and civil rights were Black people. Like, we believe in the American dream. We just want to have a fair share at it, a fair stake at it.
Thank you. Let me go on with a couple more questions. From Jane, is there a summary of which towns are not adhering to the New Jersey Supreme Court's mandates to fulfill Mount Laurel doctrine? How do we organize to call these towns into accountability? This goes back to you, Eric, because you're the expert in this area. So if you could answer that, and then I have a couple more.
Fortunately, and I'll be quick because I know that fortunately the 2015 New Jersey Supreme Court case really was a legendary decision that really didn't allow towns to hide from that. So all the towns who are either in compliance or they're being sued by us. I'm saying, and not many are left. So if you want to find out if your town is in compliance, please sign up for our email, get in contact with us, and I'll let you know for certain if your town is compliant or not.
Okay. A question from Memon. I am the product of affordable housing, educated myself and raised my children in their younger years in affordable housing. I would have not been able to build my career without the assistance. Now, a stable, long-time homeowner, my spouse and I are looking to provide affordable housing opportunities for others. What sort of incentives and opportunities are there for small, everyday people as opposed to developers to create small pockets of affordable housing within my community and state? And I don't know if Gantry wants to answer that question, or if not, get back to Professor Cashin. What are some ways that community folks can access incentives for housing opportunities?
Yeah, that's not my wheelhouse.
It's a tough question.
I'm not from New Jersey, although my mother is
Yeah.
from Jersey City. I spent my summers with my grandma in Jersey City. So I'm not familiar with specific programs in Jersey, but I'll say that the questioner might want to see if there's a community development corporation in her locality, in her community. That's a small scale affordable housing. Most community development corporations, what do? They're nonprofit entities that a lot of them develop affordable housing by hook or by crook. I am actually married to, my husband has 2 small rental houses and has been, and he always charges less than others do, trying not to trying to, make some money, but not be ridiculous. And, we've never participated in taking a Section 8 voucher, but it's something you can consider. If you invest in a property and own a rental property, you might consider taking someone who has a opportunity voucher, they're low income, right? And be open to having that person as a renter. And you end up getting paid the rent by the federal government or the local housing authority, I think, which some people actually like that because of the consistency. But those are ways to think about participating in being a provider of affordable housing.
Yeah, thank
And
you.
there are local affordable housing trust funds that every town has. So you can ask the town about or it's public information, how much is in your local town affordable housing trust fund, and if you're developing affordable housing, redeveloping or reconstruction, or wanted to build some affordable housing, the local affordable housing trust fund are usually a place to go. And I want to highlight something that Professor Cashin said that was very, very important. There are people all across this country who are deciding to do what Professor Cashin just said. I remember years ago, I was in Brooklyn, and in Leftwood Gardens, there was a community there that decided they were not going to go up on the rents, but they were going to stabilize that local community, Leftwood Gardens, it was called, in Brooklyn, to create integration and to keep rents at a local level, at a level where people of all different backgrounds can afford to live in that community. So that's another way I want to highlight Professor Cashin's comments about that.
The other thing the person could do if they're really interested is maybe get involved with a CDC and get on the board. And, you know, if they're not developing it themselves, at least being part of the advocacy for an organization that is.
Yeah, I'm aware that there's also down payment assistance that families can get to purchase a home if they meet a certain income requirement. So that's also another opportunity. I have another question that's also anonymous. Can anyone speak about the racist covenants on property deeds and its continued impact?
I am not, so racially restrictive covenants, which federal government insisted that, this is part of the redlining scheme, insisted that any property that they insured would have them. So they taught people to racially restrict. So many properties, if you go and have your title company search, they'll probably show up somewhere along in the deed, but they are sort of ancient ruins of a former time. They're unenforceable. And I'm not aware of them having modern significance. If they are, so they're violating the Fair Housing Act. It's, you know, it's utterly illegal to discriminate against someone in the purchase or renting of a property based on race, disability, several different statuses. So I think they're more, to the extent that if they still exist in a deed, first of all, there's no reputable realtor that would even touch a transfer that had, you know, an active clause like that in there, right? So I think it's more a testament to our past. I'm not aware of any active. Now, that doesn't mean there's not discrimination, but people are writing this down, you know. That doesn't mean there's not discrimination in the housing markets.
And they were violently enforced, by the way. I mean, the communities used violence to enforce them. They were, you know, firebomb people's homes and threaten their white neighbors if they sold to a person of color, that they would be threatened as well. So all of those things were violently enforced. It wasn't just the federal government sanctioning it, but the communities themselves was using violence to make sure it happened.
Okay. So I have about 5 minutes and I have possibly 2 more questions. This one is from Kiki to Reverend Dobson. How do you recommend that families think about home ownership from a wealth building perspective? Are there places to look and not look?
Oh, what a great question. I can go on, we can have a whole seminar about that. And there's precedents that show that Black home ownership has not yielded wealth as what white home ownership has, because the predatory lending that Gantry family experienced, that Professor Cashin writes about, that they're lending in these areas, or what they do is you know, communities who are segregating towards more, let me put it this way. If you move into a community that's so-called diverse, if you're not careful, if you're not understanding what was happening in that community can quickly segregate it to more low-income folks. So too often, Black and brown folks are racially steered to communities. Oh, here's a nice house in the suburbs, not looking at the racial data that's showing that in the next few years, that community going to be racially segregated, all Black and minority, and they're going to be disinvested in. And so that's the trap that Black folks have been steered and preyed upon for many years. And that's why we haven't been able to accumulate wealth, because those communities that we do move into, or we do get an opportunity to move into, are communities that we were racially steered. And so let me show you this nice house. It's a single family home, but not realizing that community is already attracting more of the same group of people, opposed to having a more diverse style community. So that's very important. You got to look at housing trends. You got to look what's happening in the neighborhood. Let me give you an example and I'll stop. In Philadelphia, the most diverse communities in Philadelphia is called the Northeast section in Philadelphia. And what happens is a lot of Blacks have moved into parts of Northeast that was already working class or low income whites. So what the trend happens, this happens all around the country, Blacks move into areas that are already low income whites, and those low income whites move out, and that community quickly becomes a high poverty neighborhood. That's the trap. And we have to be very strategic about where we move into and making sure that we're not, being offered money that in gentrifying communities in our urban regions, because the urban regions are coming back. You want to stay in those homes, right? You don't want to take the $100,000 offer, although you paid $9,000 for your house. The $100,000 sounds good, but in a year when they flip that house, is worth $500,000, and you have missed that wealth. So these are some key things. I can talk all day about this, so I'll stop. But those are the things how we get trapped.
All right, and I have one more question that somebody asked that I want to make sure we cover, and it's Eric, you're the best person to answer it. What is the Mount Laurel doctrine, and what requirements does it? I think this is the second part is what I'm more interested in. What requirements does it put in places for towns like West Windsor that are currently making decisions to redevelop large areas of land? I'm assuming that there are other communities that are doing this. So how can the Mount Laurel doctrine be used to make sure that there are affordable housing opportunities there?
So I want to speak specifically about West Windsor, because I will have to look up their case, but I'll tell you what's happening around the country, around New Jersey, in terms of particularly New Jersey, around the Mount Laurel doctrine. So the Mount Laurel doctrine requires that you zone for the opportunity for affordable housing in case that land gets redeveloped for housing. So the Mount Laurel doctrine doesn't enforce housing. It tells the town that you have to create your master plan and look at areas that is redeveloping or changing. For instance, malls are going out of business, right? We all know we're buying stuff online. So malls are going out of business. So what Mount Laurel doctrine says, if that mall is sold to a developer and that developer is going to build housing, 20% of it should be set aside for affordable housing. So we're seeing this all across New Jersey. The geographical area in terms of how we shop, how we do business is changing. Office malls or office buildings are closing down. So the law says if you rezone that area for housing, then 20% of it has to be affordable. So we're reimagining America today because we're all shopping online and we're doing different things. So what the law requires is if you have to have overlay zoning, you have to have zone, what are areas that you think will be changing or redeveloping or opportunities for housing. If you designate that area and if that area of land is sold for housing, 20% of it has to be for affordable. So malls are going out of business, office parks are going out of business, all the gas stations, car dealerships are going out of business. So Mount Laurel says, that the doctrine says, if you rezone that for housing, 20% of it has to be for affordable.
All right, and on that comment, we will end our questions for today. Unfortunately, we're out of time. And so let me please thank the panelists, Eric Dobson, Professor Cheryl Cashin, and Gantry Fox. It's been such a rich and important conversation today. It's full of actionable advice on how to advance this movement for reparative justice going forward. I also want to take the opportunity to highlight some of the key points that have been made by our speakers today. First and foremost, New Jersey has a long way to go on equitable housing justice. That was obvious from today's discussion. This movement needs participation from all of us, the public sector, the private sector, the nonprofit community, and clearly residents, in order to ensure that every New Jerseyan has access to safe, healthy, and affordable homes. As Reverend Dobson mentioned, policymaking is one way to address the issue. Our elected officials have recognized the need of their constituents by supporting the Mont Laurel Doctrine and by passing Fair Chance in Housing Act to expand and protect everyone's basic human rights to housing. However, let's not forget, enacting laws is just the first step. These laws must also be enforced and they must be well funded. The Fair Share Housing Center has an action alert and is encouraging us who are here on tonight's call to participate. The Fair Housing Center also is encouraging all of us to contact our elected officials using the link in the chat and to let them know to prioritize housing in the 2022 budget. Two other things that the Fair Share Housing Center share with us today. There is a number of upcoming events that they are engaged in to support this issue. You can join them this Friday in Trenton to continue the housing justice in New Jersey conversation that was mentioned earlier. That link is also in the chat. Another event is the May 18th rally at the State House for cannabis sales revenues to be reinvested in communities of color. That link is also in our chat if you're interested. All of tonight's speakers also encourage us to expand our knowledge of the subject matter by reading. Reverend Dobson recently published a blog about the link between affordable housing and structural racism. Professor Cashin has published numerous books on the history of racial discrimination in housing and the need for repair, including in her 2021 publication, which I mentioned earlier, White Space, Black Hood, Opportunity Hoarding and Segregation in the Age of Inequality. You can visit her website to learn more about her scholarship. Professor Cashin also has reminded us that while there is work to be done, we need to remember that change is possible. And she has offered examples of places leading the way. You can read more about the work happening around the country in her political article. The link is also in the chat. Our speakers also agree that we must refrain prevailing hurtful narrative about affordable housing. Gantry offers some great advice on talking to our friends, families, and colleagues about this issue to build support. Finally, New Jersey has a long list of grassroots organizations and coalitions, including the Fair Share Housing Center. All of them are leading transformational work in your area. This is by no means a complete list, so we encourage you to find your local groups and join them. I want to thank you once again for being part of this interactive discussion. Thank you for the privilege of your time, and we'll now turn this back over to Kiki Jamison.
That was a fantastic conversation. I'd like to thank our moderator, Grizelia Berry, and our panelists, Reverend Eric Dobson, Professor Cheryl Cashin, and Gantry Fox. I'd also like to recognize the fund's 23 partners and co-sponsors, without whom this event would not be possible. I hope that you've enjoyed the conversation and are inspired to get involved. By Monday, you'll receive an email with resources and information to help you drive change in your community. And that will include a link to this program that you're welcome to share with friends and colleagues. Additionally, we hope that you will participate in the next session of Imagine More, Racial Justice Begins With Us, which focuses on reaching equity in education. This event will take place on May 17th And more information can be found at www.imaginemorenj.org. If you missed our previous events, Eliminating the Racial Wealth Gap and Ending Poverty, and Disrupting the Criminal Justice System, you can also view them at the website. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Have a great evening.
Other-